almost depressing. The
Yeah.
guy was so, like, he was just devastated that he lost. It's really interesting. So where I work at Australian National University, they have this huge project on AI, and so we have a lot of talks on AI and a lot of people researching it. So one talk was basically about this whole project. It was really interesting. So then after the talk, I went and watched the documentary. But yeah, it's like cool, but also kind of like I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah, it was like the same
Yeah.
thing when like beat what's his name, the Russian guy in chess. Like computer just
Mm-hmm.
dominated us at everything, and then like, oh yeah, I thought I was good at that, and then nope.
Yeah. Before you know it, you're gonna be having YouTube debates with computers, and it's like they're just gonna destroy you.
Yep, I can see
Oh
that.
man, that would be that would be crazy.
So anyway, we are now
Yeah.
live. So just so you know,
Oh,
so
great.
don't give
Cool.
up any of the secrets or anything.
All right. My lips are sealed.
So Liz, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. I actually saw you first on Capturing Christianity talking about Pascal's wager, and I was really interested in having a discussion about it because it is a topic that I don't usually get to talk about much on my channel. So would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Liz. I currently work at Australian National University, so I'm a postdoc. So basically, I do research in philosophy, and the topic of my postdoc is ethics, risk, and decision theory. So I'm doing that right now. I'm actually in the US for coronavirus reasons, but technically still employed just remotely. And then in the fall, I'm going to start at Ryerson University, which is a university in Canada, as an assistant professor there. So yeah, I did my PhD in philosophy at Notre Dame, and my main research is in epistemology and philosophy of religion. So, especially, I guess, yeah, in philosophy of religion, my main areas of research are kind of the nature of faith and whether faith can be rational, and then also Pascal's wager, kind of, is it a good argument? What are the problems with it? And I tend to be on the side of, at least I think there's a lot of plausible replies to objections that people have raised. I don't necessarily think every single objection just has a totally decisive reply, but I think in general it's a pretty interesting and pretty plausible argument. So I think we kind of disagree about that. So it'll be fun. It'll be fun to talk more and learn from each other. And, I like to think about it more of a discussion rather than a debate, because I want to make it about the ideas, not about, making someone look good or making someone look bad, but just sort of like learning and seeking truth together. So,
Yeah, it sounds great.
yeah.
Exactly what I was hoping for. So, from my perspective, I've never heard a version of Pascal's wager that I found compelling or thought was a good argument. Could you outline what version you believe is good? I know you sent me some notes, and those would be just great to go over for the audience because I don't think they are aware of most of that stuff.
Yeah, totally. So, what I wanted to start the discussion with was basically just sort of two assumptions. We all make assumptions all the time, and I think, at least insofar as we're aware of them, it's good to kind of get them out up front and be honest with them. So, here's two that I'm going to kind of make for the purpose of this discussion. And I think Tom basically agrees with these. So, the first is that in general, decision theory is a good guide to decision making. And we can talk more about what exactly that is. But basically, decision theory is a way to model rational decision making. And I think a version of it is almost universally accepted by philosophers, economists, etc., as just a good theory of practical rationality, a good theory of how we should make decisions and how we should act. And so I think this is like a pretty, even though I'm assuming it's a pretty solid thing to assume. So I guess there was a few things I just wanted to kind of note about decision theory, as a little bit of an intro or a background. The first thing is that almost every decision we make every day could be modeled using decision theory. So consider, like, should I buy car insurance? Something like that. You could actually model that using decision theory, thinking about like the probability you get in an accident, and then how much is it to get, full coverage versus just the basic coverage. So you can just model all of that in a really basic decision table. So it's not this like crazy thing. It's not even, in some senses, it's not even that controversial, because you can model almost any decision using decision theory. So another thing about decision theory that I think is important to note is that it actually doesn't tell you what beliefs or desires to have. It doesn't tell you what you should input into decision theory, but instead it tells you how to be rational, sort of given your beliefs and your desires. And I think this will probably come up later, because my version of Pascal's wager is similar. It's not going to tell you what beliefs and desires to have. It's going to be about how to be rational given your beliefs and your desires. So you might say, in this sense, it's sort of like subjective, It's sort of person dependent, but it does take seriously that what's rational for you depends on your beliefs and desires. So it's sort of a means end thing. It's like, you want this, okay, go do this thing. So I guess I think this is, I mean, we can talk more about like what decision theory is and what it says as we go through the discussion, but I just think this is important to note because in an interview I did with Cam about Pascal's wager, a lot of people were giving comments and objections that were kind of just based on misunderstandings of decision theory, or maybe not realizing that this is sort of a background assumption I have. Someone said, oh, you're just too focused on like consequences, but that's kind of part of the point, that consequences really matter and what happens to us in the future matters. That's sort of a standard part of decision theory. So
Yeah,
things
I'm happy to grant
that
that. That's a good assumption to start with.
yeah, consequences matter. Yeah, and yeah, no. And decision theory is a good theory of practical rationality. Great. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is that it's not the case that all religions have probability 0. So you shouldn't assign all religions, it's not impossible that they're true, or there's at least some chance that at least one religion is true. So why think this? Well, there's at least 2 reasons. The first is just about orthodox probability theory. So in probability theory, there's this axiom that's called regularity. And regularity basically says only logical contradictions or maybe metaphysical impossibilities should be given probability 0. So according to this theorem, even violations of the laws of nature wouldn't be given probability 0, even if they were given a really low probability. So if you're someone who's like really skeptical of miracles or skeptical of certain religious claims, this would say, yeah, maybe you should give that a low probability, but you shouldn't give it probability 0. So that's the first reason. And then the second reason is just because I think there's really widespread disagreement about religion. And lots of smart people have written sustained defenses of various religions. And you can say, yeah, that's fine, but their claims are still really unlikely. I'm totally on board with that. That's fine. But if you say like all of these claims have probability 0, that's just like, that's a really extreme claim. So if you say that, then what I say today won't really have bite for you. You might not be interested in what I'm talking about. The version of the wager, I guess, I'm defending won't have bite for you. But I think most professional philosophers, even atheists, most epistemologists would say that there's something irrational about assigning all of those religions probability 0. So those are sort of my 2 assumptions.
Awesome. So yeah, I think I agree with all of that as far as I can tell. So could you tell us a little bit about your version of Pascal's wager and what version you prescribe?
Great. So maybe I'll just start with a really basic version of the wager. I mean, I don't know. We were talking about at the beginning how it's hard to tell, how familiar your audience is with these arguments, and whether they're experts on Pascal's wager or whether they've never even heard of it before. I'm sure they're probably somewhere in the middle, but just so everyone's on the same page, I'll just give a really basic version of the wager. And that basically has 2 premises and a conclusion. So premise 1 says we ought to maximize expected value. Basically what that means is it's referring to what I was talking about before with decision theory. So we ought to do the thing that, according to decision theory, gives us the best chance at getting something that's the most valuable. That's basically what it's saying. So we can talk more about that if you want, but that's sort of related to the thing I'm assuming. That is also a certain decision rule that you apply to decision theory, and you can apply other decision rules as well. But I sort of just picked it for simplicity, and not a lot hangs on whether you use that decision rule or another. And it's also like the most common in classical rules. So I just decided to go with it just for the sake of argument. But I don't think that in and of itself isn't really going to be relevant to Pascal's wager. So that's the first premise. The second premise says belief in God maximizes expected value. So then the conclusion says, thus you should believe in God. So the second premise is going to be where a lot of the action is. So why think that belief in God maximizes expected value? And here's the basic thought. And so this thought is obviously inspired by this guy named Pascal, who wrote the Pensée a long time ago. But I'm not a historian, so I'm not as interested in, giving an analysis of like historical analysis of Pascal's writing as much as I am interested in the ideas behind it. But this is often attributed to him, although there's debates about whether he was even the first one to bring it up, but that's not our topic today either.
Yeah.
So, but here's the basic idea. There's two states of the world. Either God exists or God does not exist. And then there's two actions you can take. You can believe in God or you cannot believe in God. If you believe in God and God exists, things look very good for you, potentially infinitely good if you go to heaven or something. If you believe in God and God does not exist, then either way, what you gain or lose is arguably finite. And then if God does not exist and you, so if you believe in, no, I'm like getting it confused. But so then the basic idea is that, if you don't believe in God and God exists, maybe you're annihilated, which means, you get zero, or you go to hell, which would be like a negatively infinitely bad thing. So you could have negative infinity or you could have zero there. And if you don't believe in God and God does not exist, maybe you have a true belief, but still arguably whatever you gain or lose is finite. And so then this really basic version of the wager, which I think we have to make it more complex than this, but this really basic version of the wager would say, look, believing in God is associated with this infinite good. Not believing in God is either gives you something finite or gives you something infinitely bad. So believing in God's infinitely better than not believing in God. So that's the really basic version, just as sort of background. So what I want to do now is sort of give a little bit more of a nuanced version, although as we go through objections, I might have to make some more caveats because it is sort of complicated to kind of incorporate all the objections. I do have a paper that it's called Salvaging Pascal's Wager, and if you go on my website, you can download it there, and that will give you like all the details. So if you're like, what's the ultimate version of the wager that Liz wants to defend, you can look at that paper. So I am doing a little bit of simplifying here, but as we go through objections, we can kind of talk about some of the complexities here. Okay, so here's the more nuanced version of the wager. Premise 1 is the same. It says we ought to maximize expected value. And then premise 2 says this. Committing to or cultivating belief in the religion that you take to be most probable maximizes expected value.
Could you say that one more time slowly?
Yes. So committing to or cultivating belief in the religion that you take to be most probable maximizes expected value. And so there's a couple key things here. The first is that we don't make it just about believing directly. We're not just saying, believe in this religion, but we're saying you make a commitment to it. And that's a totally action-based thing. So that's not necessarily about belief at all. Or you cultivate belief in it. You take actions that make it more likely you believe it. But you don't necessarily just, believe it directly in the same way you could, raise your hand or something. So that's the first key part. And then the second key part is that the relevant religion is the religion that you personally take to be most probable. And this comes back to what I was talking about earlier, how decision theory takes as inputs your beliefs and your desires. So one thing that I really want to emphasize is I'm not trying to argue that everyone should be a Christian. I'm not trying to argue that at all. And there might even be cases where you could maximize expected value and not be a theist that we can get to later. But I'm saying take the religion that you take to be most probable based on your assessment of the evidence. Then you should commit to that religion or you should cultivate belief in that religion. I want to note here, there is a few key exceptions to this claim. So I think this claim holds for most people for the beliefs and desires they actually have. But there are going to be some exceptions, and I'm happy to discuss those more. We can talk about those as we get into more objections. But
could you give us one example of the exceptions?
Yeah, here's one example. Okay, so it starts with this quote from Homer Simpson, and he says, "What if we're going to the wrong church and we're just making God matter and matter?" And that's kind of a joke, but it gets at this theology that says, look, God is a very jealous God. And if you commit to the wrong religion, that's going to piss God off and send you to the deepest level of hell or something. But if you just remain neutral and don't commit to a religion at all, God looks way more favorably upon that. And maybe this theology would say that atheists or agnostics are in some sense neutral. So they're not making God jealous. They're kind of just floating in the middle. And so if you think that this is very likely God's nature, if you kind of have this view that Homer Simpson does, that if you practice the wrong religion, you piss God off a lot. But if you just remain neutral and don't practice religion at all, then maybe you're just annihilated, or maybe it's not so bad for you. Then you can get the math to work out so that you actually shouldn't commit to or cultivate belief in the religion you take to be most probable. I mean, there's two things to note here. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I just want to cover my bases. So the first thing to note is that on this view, it still is arguably a version of Pascal's wager, because you're taking afterlife considerations into account in your decision making. And at least in my view, that's sort of the key part of Pascal's wager, is you need to do what's going to work out best for you in the afterlife, and that's a super important part of decision making. So that's one thing to note, is it's still a version of Pascal's wager, even though it doesn't say you should commit to or cultivate belief in a religion. But second, I think there's actually some interesting arguments against not Pascal's theology, Homer Simpson's theology. Some reasons to think that might not be exactly right. We might not think that atheists and agnostics are neutral in a way that people practicing the wrong religion aren't. So I'm happy to go into that more if you want, but yeah, I do think that could be an exception to this general rule, like if you have a theology like that.
Okay.
Okay, cool. So premise 1, we ought to maximize expected value. Premise 2, committing to or cultivating belief in the religion you take to be most probable maximizes expected value. And then the conclusion is that you should commit to or cultivate belief in the religion you take to be most probable. And one more thing to say about this too. So probably the most common off the cuff, just like initial response that people give to Pascal's wager is, well, which religion should you pick? There's a bunch of religions. If you practice Christianity and Islam is true, you might not go to heaven, you might go to hell, depending on how exclusive the version of Islam is, whatever. So which religion do you pick? And so this sort of answers that, and it says you should pick the religion that you take to be most probable. And the reason for that is because of this decision theory assumption that we should maximize expected value. And I can give a really quick analogy if you'd like. And I gave the same analogy to Cam, so if you already heard that interview, then this will be review for you. But I was saying, look, let's say you're on a game show and there's 2 doors. And this is a very special game show because behind each door, there's some chance at getting something infinitely good, or what someone doing decision theory might call infinite utility, something that's like, yeah, infinitely good or infinitely valuable. And behind the first door, if you pick that door, the chance you get that infinitely good thing is 0.99999. And behind the second door, the chance you get that infinitely good thing is 0.0000001. And so I was like, look, you should clearly pick the first door rather than the second door. And so this just illustrates the idea that we should go for our highest chance at infinite utility. It doesn't matter if the value in question is infinite or finite, we should go in for our highest chance of that. And so that's why you should commit to or cultivate belief in the religion that you take to be most probable. So I hope that it, at least illustrates the beginnings of a response to the mini-gods objection. I'm happy to talk more about that. I don't know if there's anything else you want me to cover. I mean, again, look, I'm not arguing everyone should be a Christian. There can even be cases where I'm not arguing you should be a theist. But I still think we probably disagree on some stuff. So,
well, yeah, my first question would be, what is the purpose of an argument? Because from my understanding, the purpose of an argument is to compel people who disagree with you.
Uh-huh.
And from what you said about your argument, it seems like what you're saying could be summarized as, you should believe what you think will get the most reward.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically what decision theory says. I think there's 2 senses, though, in which what I'm arguing is controversial. The first is, it's probably going to have the result that most people should commit to God. Most people should commit to some kind of religion, namely the religion they take to be most probable. So you could take someone who assigns Christianity, a 10% chance of being true, or even lower. If that's the highest probability religion, and then excluding a few caveats like the Homer Simpson thing, but if they don't think Homer's theology is very likely, then they should commit to Christianity. They should try to cultivate belief in Christianity. they should go to church, they should seek a relationship with God. I mean, that's super controversial, I would think. I think a lot of people think if your probability is that low, then you shouldn't commit to God. And the other thing I'm pushing too that I think you would disagree with is that afterlife considerations should be a key part of our decision making. So when we're thinking about what to do and whether to go to church and who to hang out with and all this stuff, we should be thinking about the afterlife, and that should play a big role in even our day-to-day decisions. So you're right that decision theory is inherently subjective and that it tells you how to be rational given your beliefs and your desires. And what I'm kind of saying is, given the beliefs and desires of most people, they should probably commit to God, and they should definitely take the afterlife into consideration. So, does that help? Does that answer
Well, yeah,
the
but I
question?
actually agree with
Yeah.
all of that. So I think that if there is an afterlife or the possibility of an afterlife, we should actually take that into account into our beliefs. So let me
Oh,
tell you what
great.
my objection to the classical Pascal's wager is, and you can tell me how you that would how may or may not fit into your interpretation. So
Sure.
my defeater for Pascal's wager would be to argue that belief that there is no God is equally as likely to get you the infinite reward as belief there is a God. So if that statement is true, that would of course mean Pascal's wager is false. There's no reason to believe in a God over not God. And so the main argument is like the many gods hypothesis that you proposed earlier. There's lots of different possible kinds of a gods. There's a kind of a God that would reward you for believing in it, and there's a kind of a God who would reward you for not believing in it. And those, from my perspective, are equally as likely. And it's equally as likely there is a God who would reward you for not picking your nose on a Tuesday, or for eating this jelly donut or not eating this jelly donut. And so there's those five different kinds of gods. Each one would be equally as likely to reward you for that particular action or belief as the God that would do the opposite and reward you for not that action or that belief. And there's no difference between those two a priori. They're all just a God for giving you a reward for heaven for believing in it is equally as likely as a God who would give you entry into heaven for not believing in it. So whether we believe in God or not, it makes no difference towards the probability of which one's going to give us the infinite reward from my perspective. So that's if God exists and we don't know anything about the God, then belief and non-belief are equally as likely to give us the reward. Therefore, Pascal's wager would be false if we're just considering there is a God. And then I'd go one step further and I'd say, even if we assume there is no God, the possibility of a heaven with no God is equally as likely as the possibility of a heaven with a God. So, for example, there could be gods that exist that don't create heavens. Maybe they only care about black holes or rabbits and only let rabbits into heaven and don't care about humans at all. And so there's a possibility that nature itself could just generate a heaven as a part of how nature works, like maybe karma or dharma or the naturalistic kinds of religions who don't entail a god per se, but have some kind of eternal, all powerful function of the universe that produces an afterlife and rewards and punishes people. And those could exist equally as likely as a God could. So even if there is no God, belief in a God and belief in no God are still equally as likely to get you the infinite reward, because maybe this law of nature, the karma or dharma, instead of rewarding morality and being a moral person, maybe it rewards not believing things that don't have evidence or something like that, or takes something like the atheist worldview and rewards that for some reason. And so it seems like no matter which way you look at it, whether there is a God or there is no God, and whether or not we believe or not believe, the probabilities a priori are exactly the same. So the part where I don't know how this fits into your worldview is that where you include the part where it's reasonable to believe whichever religion you think is the most probable. And so from that perspective, I mean, I agree that whatever you have the most evidence to believe is true, you should believe. That's just how evidence works. But I don't see why we should believe in a God as opposed to a not God. I don't see any reason to do that in the first place. Now, after that, I mean, I agree that if you believe there is sufficient evidence to warrant belief that one particular God is more probable than the antithesis, then sure, that is a reason to believe it. That would count as evidence from my perspective. But I don't see why we should do that in the first place.
Okay, there's like a lot there. So I think we should take it slow and try to break down little parts of that because there's a lot of good stuff, but I want to like give it all the attention it deserves. Okay. The first thing, so when I say you should believe in or commit to the religion you take to be most probable, that isn't just to make a trivial claim about kind of epistemic rationality, because you could say, look, I think atheism is 99% likely to be true, but I think theism, maybe Christianity specifically, I just use that as an example, is 0.5 likely to be true, and then all the other religions are less likely. And then in that case, I would say, well, you should cultivate belief in Christianity. Does that make sense? So it's not, so
Oh yeah,
you're
yeah,
going,
absolutely. So that's the
because
main.
atheism isn't a religion, is kind of the point.
Well, yeah,
So
since atheism doesn't entail a heaven or an infinite reward, and theism does, you would prefer the infinite reward under theism because there is a reward there. That makes
right,
perfect sense. So, but that would come
right.
into my second part of my argument, where I would say that even under atheism, it's equally as likely to have an infinite reward.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's where I just want to kind of, I mean, we this might end up being boring because we might not actually disagree as much as I thought. But one question I have for you is, do you think atheists are just as likely to go to heaven as theists, or as people that commit their lives to God and make big sacrifices for God and pursue God? Do you think it's this equal probability that atheists go to heaven, and that like we can take theists that make serious sacrifices for God?
Yes,
Do
I
those
would
have
say
equal
that.
probability of going to heaven?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I'd say that we have no evidence to conclude what the ultimate nature of reality is, whether it's a God or a natural thing, whether there's a heaven or not. And the probability that any one particular action or set of actions is likely to get you into that heaven is no more or less probable than any other set of actions. So picking your nose on a Tuesday is equally as likely to get you into heaven as devoting your life to Jesus.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I mean, you're alluding to this thing. It's called the mixed strategies objection, and it's just saying Pascal's wager gives all decisions the same expected value, but that objection is based on this idea that you take the probability and you multiply it by infinity, and then they're all just infinite. And so that's why I gave the game show analogy, because it's supposed to show like probability matters. And what I think you're coming back and saying is, oh, but like the probability of all of those is just exactly the same. And that's, I mean, that's a view. You can totally have that view. And honestly, the entire paper that I wrote that I was talking about earlier, that's not going to touch that. But part of what we were sort of pushing is, if you do have this view that theists are more likely to go to heaven than atheists, we can, we're not saying you have to have that view or anything, but if you do have that view, then you should be a theist, for example. So you're basically just saying, I just think any action is just as likely to send you to heaven as any other action. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly
So
right.
like even murdering, like
Yep.
spending your life like Jeffrey Dahmer versus like Mother Teresa, you think they're equally likely to go to heaven?
Yes, I think that it's equally as likely there is
Wow.
a God that would reward moral actions that we see as moral versus a God that would reward immoral actions. So it's equally as likely that Mother Teresa would be allowed into heaven as Hitler or something, because we have no reason to conclude anything about if there was a heaven, what would it be like, or if there was a God, what would it be like. The properties of its nature are essentially ambiguous. We can just pick, maybe it has this property, and that is equally as likely as just pick any other alternative negation of that.
I mean, so you're kind of alluding to indifference principles, which is that sort of before we have evidence or before we look at something, we should assign P and not P both like 50-50 probability, right?
Yep.
But I think we have some evidence that there's a sense in which like Mother Teresa is morally better or deserves a reward or something good, and someone like Hitler or Jeffrey Dahmer does not. And so even if a priori we're using these indifference principles, I think like we can learn moral truths and kind of make moral judgments about other people, such that it's more likely or someone's more deserving of heaven than someone else. So maybe you just deny that, I guess.
Well, no, I totally agree with that, but I would say that if we assume there is a God or a heaven, we also have to assume that the entry conditions for this God or heaven are morality. Like those aren't necessarily linked. So I agree Mother Teresa is more moral, given Christopher Hitchens
Mm-hmm.
doesn't like her very much. But there is that doesn't necessarily mean anything related to heaven or the reward. Like what are the conditions to get the reward? Well, we don't know. So it wouldn't be reasonable to conclude that, well, we like this person better and think this person should be rewarded. Therefore, the God does too. That doesn't make any
Okay.
sense.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I guess some people think if God exists, God will have certain good attributes or something like just or omnibenevolent or whatever. Maybe you just don't think. I mean, that's a conditional claim too, so an atheist could affirm that. It's just saying if God exists, God will be this particular way, or likely be this particular way, or be the greatest conceivable being, or something like that. So maybe you just think if God exists, we just have no idea what God's like, or something like. I don't know. Is that your view? Or
Yes, pretty much. So from my perspective,
okay,
all of the theistic arguments, like the ontological argument, the greatest possible being, and that it has some kind of moral nature to it, Anselm's arguments, and the pure act, and the objective morality, and omniscience, omnipotence, all of those things are just arbitrary things that we label it. And they may or may not apply at all. They could just pick a different property and say it has these properties. Like there are some that I would agree on. Like I think that there's a minimum requirement for a God, that it's like either eternal, all powerful, and necessary. You got those three, you got a God essentially. But it doesn't need any consciousness or morality or any of the other properties attributed to it. And so, as long as we have something that's one of those three or all of those three, that can act as a grounds for everything. And so, granting that much really tells us nothing about what this God is like, or what it would accept or not accept into the heaven if there was potentially one.
yeah. I mean, sure, but I do want to be clear on what the question, the relevant question is, and it's not what is God in fact like. It's what is it most like? What is most likely? What is God most likely like? Is it more likely that God rewards just people and doesn't reward, bad people? And I think you're just saying those are equally likely. So I don't want to make any claims about what God is in fact like. All you need for, I guess, a more interesting version of the wager to go through is just to think that it's slightly more likely that God would reward certain things and not reward other things. And I at least think it's maybe slightly more likely that Mother Teresa gets rewarded than Hitler, or that theists get rewarded than atheists. But again, there is a subjective nature to this argument, and if you're like, nope, theists and atheists, same probability, well, so it's interesting if you say it's the same probability, then you're in a situation where actually being a theist and being an atheist have the same expected value for you.
Mm-hmm.
So this is similar to a situation like you go to an ice cream store and you equally like two flavors of ice cream, but you can only get one, right? Or if you want to have a more serious example, you're choosing between, like, you just applied to colleges and you're choosing between like Juilliard and like Yale, or like
Yeah.
your career in law versus your career in music or whatever. And really they're in some sense equal, or at least on a par. They have the same expected value for you.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about these cases is that it's not at all clear which one you should pick for decision, like according to decision theory.
Well,
And
only
some
considering
people
those
say,
variables, then you would add in another variable
mm-hmm,
and say, which one do I like
okay,
for this additional variable? For example, I would say I would pick atheism because I like rationality more, or what I consider to be rational, and I consider following the evidence wherever it leads and not believing things that don't have evidence. And so for that reason, even though both have an infinite reward or equal probability for the decision theory consequences metric, I would then choose atheism
okay.
based on the rationality metric.
Okay, so the epistemic rationality thing is sort of like trumping for you, but you do admit that they both have equal expected value.
Yeah, with the argument I've presented,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just purely equal. So it's other than the necessary, eternal, all powerful thing, any additional property to whatever God may or may be like is equally as likely as its negation. So saying God would reward Mother Teresa is equally as likely as saying God would reward Hitler. There's no difference between those two from my perspective.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm just trying to kind of understand your position. One position that some people have is that what determines what you should believe is epistemic stuff like evidence or something, right? So, maybe like you said, you should be an atheist because given your evidence, that's like very likely, or your evidence strongly supports that, or whatever, right? But here's a separate question: how should I act? What decision should I make? And a lot of people think that's where decision theory comes in. And you could actually totally rationally believe atheism, but act like a theist. It's called what sometimes philosophers call acceptance. So you can believe atheism, but accept theism. Again, I'm not saying you should accept theism. It sounds like what you should accept is, it's like a coin flip between theism and atheism, because you think it's equally likely that theists go to hell or theists go to heaven than atheists go to heaven. But it is interesting that it's not obvious that you should, in addition to believing atheism, that you should accept atheism. It sounds like you should like flip a coin or something.
Well, I would reject that because I would say that, for example, the likelihood of whatever actions are entailed in being a theist and acting like a theist are equally or more like or equally likely to get you into heaven as doing whatever the antithesis of those actions would be, and we would just label that as the atheist thing or whatever.
Well, sure, but I'm just saying then you're in the Juilliard, Yale, or chocolate ice cream, vanilla ice cream situation with respect to action. Not we're not talking about belief anymore. So
Right.
should you act like a theist or act like an atheist? Well, it's a tie.
Right. That's why I would say that
Okay.
using decision theory, this is why I think that Pascal's wager doesn't work, because it's completely arbitrary. All of the possibilities are exactly equal, so we'd have to just dismiss Pascal's wager and decision theory on that basis and then come up with a new criteria. And that new criteria is the one we would use to decide what we should believe and how to act.
But yeah, okay. So you're just saying, I mean, but then you think the afterlife is almost irrelevant because we're completely in the dark about, um, how to maximize expected value in the afterlife. We are just 100%, we're total skeptics about that. So then you actually do think the afterlife is irrelevant and we should just think about
Sort of.
this
It's
life,
more
I
like
guess.
if we grant that the afterlife is relevant, that alone doesn't tell us anything. We could just whatever would get us to the afterlife is what we should be doing, which I grant that. But without an additional feature to tell us what that is, it's totally not worth our consideration. We can just dismiss it and say, yes, that is a true statement, but until we have a further statement that explains what we should do, it's just irrelevant.
Okay. Yeah, and actually no, I think your position makes sense. So it's like let's say take this game show again and let's say behind both doors there's something infinite, but then this door I have an additional $10 and then the other door there's nothing. So I would take infinity plus $10 rather than just infinity. So maybe for you the reason it's rational for you to act as if you're an atheist is because it's like giving you this extra finite good. I mean, I don't know you very well, so but I'm guessing. Um, you could say infinitely, they're both equal. Um, so let's look at the finite stuff to be a tiebreaker. I get this extra $10, or I enjoy my life as an atheist
That
better.
door's red. That door's
So
blue. I like red. I'm going to go with red.
yeah, no, that's fair. So I think that's totally reasonable that finite things could be a tiebreaker if the infinite ones are tied. So I think where I would probably get off the boat, and maybe others would, is just that this total skepticism about the afterlife is warranted. And again, like I said, my version of the wager doesn't speak to this at all, but I do think we at least have some evidence about what would, you know, be good afterlife wise and what wouldn't. We don't have to be indifferent between all of it. So I think that's where we disagree. But in terms of decision theory, there's at least a way to model you as totally rational. So that's good news.
Yeah, from what you've presented, I don't think I disagree with your version of Pascal's wager at all. I just don't think it has any value as an argument because I believe the purpose of arguments is to convince people who disagree. And if people who disagree essentially take something like my position, which seems to be what most atheists do, they just have a less articulated version. They just say, "There's no God. That's all silly stuff. What are you talking about?" And which essentially comes to the same conclusion of it's not worth considering. Rather, but they put the 0%, that objection, your second objection, that we shouldn't all consider all religions to have 0%. If we consider all religions, in my sense, to be equally as probable, you get the exact same result. So that position that many atheists do take, that religion has 0%, is essentially equally as reasonable as mine. You just have to phrase it differently, because you can, if they're all equal, well then they'd all filter out and there'd be no probability, and you'd be left with the some, what is it? I forget what the word you used. The finite defeater.
The finite, like, well, I called it a sweetener, but it makes this infinite a little bit better than this infinite.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah. Um,
So yeah, but yeah,
yeah.
the part that I'm most curious about is like, what is the value of your interpretation of the argument? Like, what can it be used for if it can't convince someone who holds the my version of the atheist position?
Yeah, so I wanted to come back to what you said a second ago, which is what's the purpose of arguments, right? So yeah, I mean the purpose of arguments is to convince people, but it's to convince people who disagree with your conclusion, right? So I still think that there's a lot of people. So one thing that makes an argument not interesting is if you're just giving the conclusion that everyone or almost everyone agrees with, right? That would be a pretty lame argument, and this happens in philosophy all the time. It's like people will raise their hands at conferences and be like, I don't really know who disagrees with you, or like this is like trivial or whatever. So that's a pretty lame argument, right? um But I think the reason that so I just think that insofar as my argument's controversial, you just agree with the controversial parts of my argument. So you're not really my target audience. You're not someone I'm trying to convince, at least in this paper. I mean, I could write another paper where I try to say, here's a bunch of arguments to think that it's more likely that theists go to heaven than atheists. And in that case, we would have something to debate about, right? But in this paper, you're just not my target audience, right? But part of the goal of this paper is to say, here's a bunch of more traditional objections to Pascal's wager, not yours, but the many gods objection and Pascal's mugging and this other thing, the mixed strategies objection, and how do we use infinities in decision theory anyway? And the paper is basically trying to take all of these objections and show these objections have really good answers. But again, you can come back and you can say, I think we can, I'm an afterlife skeptic, you know? I think we have no evidence about who will be rewarded or punished in the afterlife at all. So then we just take finite things into consideration. That's fine. You're just not my target audience for this paper, but there's still a lot of people that think, I mean, it's so funny when you give Pascal's wager because people are just like, many gods objection, and they assume it's like, it's over, you know? And so there are a lot of people that think that these objections are just totally decisive. So part of my and my co-author's goal for this paper was to say, well, these aren't totally decisive. Does this we're not but again, we're not saying everyone should be a Christian or anything like that. I mean, it's one paper, you just can't do that.
Oh yeah,
But
my main
yeah.
objection is in fact, like for example, the many gods argument can be phrased as the way I just phrased it. Like my argument that's saying that all afterlives are equally probable is kind of a version of the many gods argument, just phrased in a more particular way to counter the Pascal's wager kind of presentation. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to show that those contemporary responses to Pascal's wager can be phrased in a way to counter your argument just by making that same all afterlives are equal, because it has the same result of saying the all religions have 0% probability, so it's disregarded, is exactly the same as saying they all have the same probability, and so they're all disregarded.
It's not exactly the same. I mean, it's definitely different because if I shifted your probability slightly, or like, let's say I just like lowered the probability of all religions except for Christianity or something, then I could get very different results for you. Whereas if I gave someone else who assigned them all zero a bunch of evidence against every religion, then they would just already have zero probability anyway. So I think it's there's still important differences between your perspective. I mean, but you're right that there's something similar about them, which they kind of make these infinite considerations wash out in a certain way. I think though that I'm curious about like what other people think, but I do think that a lot of people aren't going to be on board with the afterlife skepticism thing. I mean, I don't interact with YouTube atheists very much, so I'm not 100% sure, but I am curious like how common this kind of thing will be, because I guess to me it seems pretty reasonable to think that theists are more likely to go to heaven than atheists. I think that's just
Obviously,
a
right?
really strong point of disagreement we have, but I guess in my view that's something that a lot of people accept, not just theists, not just Christians, but it's decently widely accepted at least. I mean, I'm curious, that's like a empirical sociological question. We would need to go out and like do a survey or something and figure out what people believe, but at least kind of even atheists that I interact with, I think would still accept that. So I am sort of curious. It's yeah,
Well, I'd actually go one step further. I
yeah,
mean, I agree. I
yeah.
think that is probably the case because most people haven't heard my arguments. But if you told them my argument, they'd probably just immediately jump on board and be like, "Yep, that."
Okay, and maybe just explain again what sort of motivated the skepticism. Maybe you could. Is it just that? I mean, you talked about
Which
indifference
skepticism?
principles, the afterlife skepticism. So you talked about indifference principles, but then I pointed out like indifference principles are a starting point, but once we start looking at evidence, we don't have to be indifferent anymore. You
Oh
know,
yeah,
in the
absolutely.
same way, you have a coin. Is it going to land heads? Obviously, I'm going to be 50-50 before, but as soon as you flip it and we see the outcome of the coin, like I'm going to either believe it's heads or tails. So it's a starting point, but it's not, once we gather evidence, you know, we don't have to just stay there. So
Oh
maybe
yeah, absolutely. I think there
what are
is
some
none.
other reasons?
I think there
Yeah,
is
go
no
ahead.
evidence. So that's kind of the thing. Is like, I think the
Mm-hmm.
contemporary evidence for the existence of a god or a particular heaven is essentially just this is what people choose to believe or were convinced by their emotions to believe thousands of years ago. It's kind of stuck culturally, and that's about it. But it really doesn't tell us anything about what the ontology of the nature is like. It's just kind of a genetic fallacy kind of a thing where people used to believe this, therefore it's evidence, which is like, not, no, it doesn't work that way. So that's
Okay.
my skepticism about afterlife comes from the fact is there is no evidence of afterlives and what they may or may not be like, as far as I can tell. Just none.
Well, I think people's beliefs are at least some kind of evidence, even if they only raise the probability a tiny bit, and some might lower it. Like, if we had a good reason to think that this whole group of people is irrational and they all believe this thing, then that would probably lower the probability of whatever they believed, you know. But it's not like people's beliefs bear on matters all the time. I mean, like actually, I was just on a walk right before I came on this video, and this woman stopped me and she said, "What time is it?" And I said 7 whatever.
Wow, good
And
social distancing.
I know, but but like I assume then just started believing it's 7 whatever just based on my belief, my reporting that to her. So I do think people's beliefs count as evidence, and they bear on what we believe all the time. Maybe not always really good evidence. It might not raise the probability a ton, but it can at least give us some evidence. And I mean, I think you could probably find like theology books at your library debating about, the nature of the afterlife and if God existed, what would God be like? What obligations would we have to God? So, I mean, to say there's no evidence at all seems strong.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So my position is strong in that sense. So I think beliefs can count as evidence, but only under certain conditions. Like for example, if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe. But if I told you I
Mm-hmm.
saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe. As far as I would consider that zero evidence if I told you I saw a unicorn.
Mm.
And the difference between those two claims is that dogs have an implicit empirical basis. We have lots of scientific evidence of dogs, their taxonomy, phylogeny, genetic makeup, chemical composition, blah, blah, blah. All of that is just implicit in the statement dog. So if I told you I saw a dog, it has the testimony evidence in addition to the implicit empirical evidence there, which makes the testimony reasonable to believe. But in the case of the unicorns have none of that implicit empirical basis. And so just based off the testimony qualifies as zero evidence if it doesn't have that empirical basis. So from my perspective, beliefs only count as evidence if they have an empirical basis to back them up. Otherwise, they're no evidence at all for things like miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs. Testimony counts as exactly zero for those cases, in my view.
Well, so one problem with that is that there's lots of non-empirical sources of evidence. Math, intuition, morality. I mean, what philosophers are doing all the time. It's non-empirical, but it's evidential. We, debate each other. We have good objections. Sometimes we have knockdown arguments. So you can't, I mean, I think saying it has to be empirical is probably too strong.
Oh, I totally
That
agree.
doesn't, okay,
So,
okay.
so my position on that is that there are other kinds of claims. Like, for example, if I claim I'm imagining a unicorn, that would be reasonable to believe. So it's only a claim that you're claiming something exists in the world apart from your imagination that requires that empirical basis. If I'm making a claim about something in my imagination, like math or logic or philosophical arguments, you don't need that empirical basis because it's not a claim about the empirical world, it's a claim about your imagination. So claims about math and logic and conceptual kinds of evidence are totally fine without any empirical basis. You don't need that at all. It's only when you're claiming something real about the world that exists apart from your imagination that you need that empirical basis.
Okay. Interesting. And so the afterlife would be you would say any claim about the afterlife would need an empirical basis. Is that your
Well,
view?
that would I would be more specific. I would say that for something to count as evidence, you need some way to differentiate it between the imaginary and the real. Empirical evidence is the method I use. I think that's a reasonable method that's been demonstrated to be reliable, but it may or may not be the only method. There could be other methods that's totally fine. But you need a method to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real for it to count as evidence. And just like the testimony part, I claimed I saw a unicorn, doesn't do that. That doesn't give us a way to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real because people make those kinds of claims all the time. So you need that additional layer that can differentiate for it to count as evidence, which is what the empirical evidence does. If I said saw a dog, because it has that extra empirical layer, that's reasonable to believe because there's a way to differentiate between the imaginary and what's real. Whereas in the case of the unicorn, it does not.
So sorry, is the issue that it's not like falsifiable
No.
if you claim you saw a unicorn? Is that what's the like? I guess I'm trying to see.
Yeah,
I
the
don't know.
issue
I don't think
is
I fully understand your position. You're when you say I saw a dog, that's like empirically falsifiable in a way that the unicorn claim isn't, or what's the difference?
Well, the difference is the empirical basis. So we have past examples of empirical evidence of dogs. We have no past examples of empirical evidence of
Oh, so
unicorns.
it's the past examples.
Yes.
That's what's key.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. So there's a lot of events that happened for the first time. People were debating and giving probabilities for whether we would have a woman president, in the last election, right? And clearly we could have evidence for and against that. We looked at the polling, all of that stuff, even though that's a completely unprecedented event. So it can't just be the past. It
Well,
has
that
to
would still
be.
fit into my model perfectly well because all of the pieces of that, a woman being president, all of those things have an empirical basis. We have empirical evidence of presidents, we have empirical basis of women, we have people being elected. There's no logical contradiction there. All of those things have a basis.
But I thought you said we have to have it past in the past,
Yeah, just
and
of
we
the
have no
class.
past.
Like
Well, we
for,
have no past instances of a woman being president.
well, it'd be the same thing with the dog. Like if I said I saw a dog, I haven't given any empirical evidence other than my testimony of that particular dog. The past evidence is from other dogs. So in the woman president example, we don't actually need an example of a woman being president. We just need an example of a woman existing empirically, of the category of president existing empirically, and people like electing presidents. So that's all we need. If we have those three things and we have an empirical basis for all of those things, then it's reasonable to believe that there could be a woman president. But like if I added in something new, if I said there was a magical woman president, that would be immediately rejectable because the magic part has no empirical basis. But all the other parts do, so they're fine.
Okay, so it's like each component of the statement has to have an empirical basis. Yeah, okay. So I guess then I mean, you just get into a lot of questions like what counts as a component, and is
Yep.
woman and president a component, or is woman president a component? Why split it more specifically rather than more generally? I
Yeah.
mean, it just gets tricky. But this isn't, I mean, I'm just kind of understanding your view. So maybe we can kind of reel this back into Pascal's wager. So then you're saying because evidence has to be, for something to count as evidence, it has to be empirically verifiable in the
Oh
past.
no. So
No.
just to clarify, for something to count as evidence, it has to be able to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. I use empirical evidence. That's not a requirement though.
Oh, okay. It has to be able to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. But then this would mean we can't have evidence for or against any claims about the afterlife because they don't differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real.
We don't have any yet.
There's
There absolutely could be evidence. Like for example, if I died and went to heaven and then came back, that's evidence. That counts.
mm-hmm,
But we don't have any
mm-hmm.
at this time. So as far as I know, we have no evidential way that can differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real to indicate what heaven is like.
Yeah. And I mean, there have been people that have supposedly died and come back. I'm not, I don't really want to, but like, do you just think that doesn't count as evidence because those are just, we can explain those away easily, or
Well, I would count
what's your
those as
view on
like
that?
testimony of the unicorns kind of a thing. Like if I did it, I would count it as evidence for me personally. So if someone died and went to
Okay.
heaven and they experienced that as real, as insofar as anything is real, then that could count as evidence for them. But if they wanted to convince everybody else, then you would need essentially empirical evidence, like scientific stuff, in the same sense to be able to convince everyone else that it's testable, repeatable, or whatever other methodology you want to use.
Okay.
So
So just a
I would accept evidence
okay.
of the afterlife if you could repeat it and demonstrate it scientifically. That would count for me. I'd be like, yep, that works as evidence.
So if a bunch of people you trust, this is just, I'm just curious, I'm not like trying to trap you or anything, but if a bunch of people you trusted, like each individually reported like seeing a unicorn in the same place at the same time, would you like raise the probability of that even a tiny bit? Or
No,
would you just, no?
same
Okay.
with
It's just
UFOs,
nothing.
same with homeopathy, same with miracles and
Okay.
magic, because that's all been happened for all of those things. I'm like, yeah, we know that doesn't work as a way to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real, because people have done that a bunch, and it's all just imaginary.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I'm just kind of like learning about your views because again, I haven't written any sustained defenses of this claim that theists are more likely to go to heaven than atheists. And I have another paper actually where I just kind of say it all just kind of hangs on that claim,
Yep.
but we don't really argue for or against it. So again, I really think we actually don't fundamentally disagree on the version of Pascal's wager that I push. I think we just disagree about this skepticism about the afterlife. So
Yeah, I totally agree. I think
So
that
yeah,
your version of the Pascal's wager is pretty reasonable. If it's more likely that you'll get a reward if you do this, then yeah, you should do that. That makes perfect sense. The only
yeah,
disagreement I have with Pascal's wager is I see no reason to believe that that is a true statement. So I totally agree with the
yeah.
logic of decision theory that if something will get you a better reward, even if it's less probable, it's a good idea to bet on it, like buying a lottery ticket essentially. If you could win, as long as it doesn't cost anything, you should just buy every lottery ticket you can. I like the ones on Facebook. I love them. They give you like a free car, like sign up your name for a free car. I sign up to all of those, like, which is
Oh
exactly
my,
essentially what your argument is. It's like
right,
all you have to
right.
do is sign up. It doesn't cost you anything, and you could win a free car. Do it. Yes, all for it. And so the only disagreement I have with Pascal's wager is I don't think the probability is there. I don't think there is a reason to believe that it's more likely.
Yeah. And I think some people might even just say it's just kind of a basic belief. So it's just like, I believe I have a hand. I couldn't really give you an argument for that. It's almost a starting point, or like 1 + 1 = 2 or whatever. And so I just kind of believe like it's more likely that theists would go to heaven than atheists would. Maybe, I mean, you could try to think about if God existed, what might God be like, and what desires might God have. I guess you're sort of saying because that doesn't differentiate, make the distinction you're wanting it to make. We just can't have evidence about that either, right? About like God's nature.
Yeah, I would say I can imagine
Yeah,
God being a certain way, but that doesn't make it more likely that he's not the exact opposite of that. The fact that I can imagine him being that way, or that I would like him to be that way, or that it would conform with my cultural beliefs or whatever, doesn't actually make that idea of a God more likely to be real than the alternative or the negation of that.
yeah. I mean, God's kind of an interesting case because some people think whether God exists might be a partially empirical matter, and there's the fine tuning argument, and obviously the problem with evil too. Both of those are sort of using empirical evidence to kind of try to figure out whether God exists or not, right? But some people also think that we can know God's existence a priori, or there can at least an element of the question of whether God exists is an a priori one, right? So the ontological argument is an example of this. I'm not, trying to say it's a good argument or anything, but it's an interesting case for you because that might be a situation where there's something about the world, but this empirical evidence, we can learn about it without appealing to empirical evidence. It's kind of an existence question that the empirical won't just perfectly answer. I mean, kind of a lot of questions in metaphysics actually might fall into this camp. So free will might be another one. Like the nature of substances and properties might be another one. So those are going to be claims that aren't scientifically falsifiable. I mean, maybe it would still fall into your theory.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
wrote an entire epistemology about this, and I've debated people on all of these arguments for a long time. It's kind of like it's my full time job. So
Sure,
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
So yeah, those examples
Oh,
do definitely fall into my. I think the ontological argument is just imaginary, and it gives us no way to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. Specifically because of the word "great" or "maximal" or "maximally excellent," if you want to use Plantinga's version. I think those terms are arbitrary, and you could just switch the definition of those terms to be their negation, and it's equally as likely.
okay. So sorry. Let me just. I know I keep repeating this, but I think I got mixed up by the empirical thing sooner and or earlier, and then I'm now thinking that's actually not that central to your view.
Hmm.
So something's evidence for something just if it tells us what's helps us distinguish between what's imaginary and what's real.
Yes.
Is that your view?
Yes.
Okay. So what if the question we're interested in isn't about what's imaginary or what's real, but it's about something else? Like, couldn't we have evidence for and against things that
Sure.
aren't just about? Okay.
So there could be other
So
categories. Like so, my epistemology usually entails three categories, which is conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical. But for the
okay,
purpose of this debate, I only went into those two because it's kind of what the relevant point is. But yeah,
I see.
there could
Okay,
be
but
other
it could be
categories. There could
broader.
be a supernatural category out there, and asking, is it supernatural for something to count as evidence? You would say you'd have to find some way to differentiate: is it imaginary from is it supernatural? I have no idea how you would do that, but that's what would be required for you to count as evidence of that new category.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay. And then but now I'm because we're distancing ourselves from this empirical thing, right?
Hmm.
Now I'm not clear why you couldn't have claims that tell you about the afterlife or give you evidence about the afterlife, because you're just now all you're just trying to do is say it helps us make this distinction between imagination and kind of existing out there in the world. But but it's not an issue of whether it's an empirical thing or not, right? So why couldn't we have claims that tell us the afterlife is this way or not this way? Why couldn't evidence bear on that? I think I'm
You
not
could.
fully seeing
You
that.
could. You just have to show
Oh,
some way to differentiate between imaginary and that new category. So if there is an afterlife that's essentially non-physical, supernatural, or whatever, if you could find some way to differentiate that from being imaginary and just something we made up in our heads, that would count as evidence too. I just don't know of any method to do that. The only method I'm aware of is empiricism. It's what I use. So, but I don't. But there could absolutely be evidence in other categories or other ways, for sure.
yeah. So I think it would be like philosophical evidence, right? It would be philosophical argumentation about God's nature, about, you know, heaven and hell. You know, we would have to look at philosophy and theology, right?
I'm not sure what you
Oh,
mean by philosophical. I don't think that would be like an ontological category. I think this is more epistemic analysis category.
it'd be like the metaphysics category, maybe.
Right. So yeah, if you had some way to differentiate imagination from metaphysics, that would definitely count as evidence. But as far as I know, there's only one metaphysical fact we can confirm, which is I think, therefore I am. And there's nothing else we can say about metaphysics, essentially.
Oh, okay, interesting. So you think your own existence is the only. So are you like a full blown skeptic? Like you
No,
can't
no.
know anything but your own existence
So I'm a
and
fallibilist. So
science?
I grant all of the external world stuff, grant other minds. I just don't think we can really know it with metaphysical
Oh,
certainty. Like
oh,
I
okay.
think, therefore I am is the only like absolute certain metaphysical fact that we can grant for certain.
Wait. Sorry. Okay. There's different things going on here. So do you think the only metaphysical fact that you said you're an infallibilist or a fallibilist?
Fallibilist.
So we can know other metaphysical facts. That's
Sure.
just the only one we can know for sure.
Yeah. So like I
So
like know that there is a TV in front of me. Now that's it's potentially a metaphysical fact. I don't know it. I can't be certain about
okay,
it, but it's a fact I know.
okay. And then what was special about I think therefore I am was that it was the one we could know for certain.
For absolute certain. It can't be false. I can't believe I exist and not exist. And be wrong. I can't
Okay,
believe I exist and be wrong no matter what.
but but there's other things in this category of metaphysical, right?
Oh yeah, for certain. Whatever the fundamental nature of reality is, all of those are metaphysical facts. We just
That
don't.
we can know.
Some of them yes, some of them no, and confirming them absolutely not.
Okay, but if we can know them, then we can get evidence about the afterlife, right? Or maybe I think I'm just missing something.
Yeah, if we could know them about the afterlife, yes, I don't think we can.
Okay, so we can know certain metaphysical things. So why is the afterlife special? What about it makes it unknowable?
Well, as far as I know, they've just seen no way to differentiate it. I mean, there could be evidence. It's definitely possible. I've just not seen any. So as far as I'm aware, there isn't any.
Okay. And then and the problem with my suggestion about like looking at philosophy and theology books about the afterlife or, you know, just looking at arguments that, you know, academics have made, what was the issue is just that.
Well, those don't give us a way to differentiate between imaginary and whatever new category you want. Those are just we can show all of those things fit into the imaginary category pretty well, just like the unicorn.
Okay. I mean, the interesting thing about this question is it's not, it's more, it's like a conditional. Like, if there's an afterlife, what would it be like? So the question isn't, is the afterlife just like a figment of my imagination or something out there in the world? That's not the question. The question is, if there's an afterlife, even if that has a super low probability and it's probably just something I made up, but if there is one, what would it be like? And so I think that's why I was getting confused about the distinction between imaginary and real earlier, potentially, because I'm just not seeing, um,
Oh yeah,
I'm not seeing
I totally get
exactly
what
how
you're
this
saying.
fits in, you
So
know?
so
Okay,
I
yeah.
grant the first claim. The first claim is that if there is an afterlife, we can just grant that. That's not the part that we need to distinguish. The part we need to distinguish between imaginary and what's real is it would be like this. Now, the particular conception we have of whatever this is going to be like, why is that more likely than its negation? And as far if there's no way to tell between this conception being imaginary as opposed to its negation being imaginary, and they're both equally as likely to be imaginary, then there's no reason to conclude one over the other. So for mine, the only part we need to distinguish is the afterlife would be like this. Why is that particular claim more likely to be real than imaginary?
Okay, so here's a possible thing, maybe. Uh, take two afterlives. One afterlife contains contradictions, the other does not. I would argue that the afterlife that does not contain contradictions is more likely than the afterlife that does contain contradictions.
Sure, I agree with
Or
that.
alternatively, take an afterlife where there's a ball that is both blue all over and red all over. arguably that's not a contradiction, but it's a kind of metaphysical impossibility, because if it's fully blue, it can't also be fully red. So take that afterlife, and then an afterlife with no such ball. It seems like the afterlife with no such ball is more likely than the afterlife without one.
Oh yeah, I would grant that. So I'm happy to grant math and logic. We can say those are metaphysical facts too if you want, and say yes, if it has logical contradictions, that is a less likely or a 0% likely afterlife.
Oh, okay. So okay, sorry. So I think maybe we're making progress. So we can have some evidence that bears on the question of what the afterlife is like.
Well, that's more of a question what reality is like. So I think when we're talking about metaphysics, what is the fundamental nature of reality? Math and logic would apply to those things. And if the afterlife is in reality, then yes, we would then by extension say it does also apply to the afterlife. But that's not the part that's really concerning. So I can grant math and logic are
Okay.
within the same I think therefore I am category. I don't usually, because I think they don't actually apply for like quantum mechanical reasons. There can actually be logical contradictions, and so that's a really iffy
Okay.
area. But if we grant that, I'm happy to grant no logical contradictions, no breaking of laws of math or whatever. But that still doesn't give us any way to believe math is or heaven is one way as opposed to the other in regards to like which one is going to give us the ultimate reward. I mean, so we could, or
Okay.
we could say that we should believe in a heaven that doesn't have logical contradictions over we should not believe in a heaven that does. That does. I mean, I can grant that, sure.
Okay. Cool. No, that's good though, because we're starting to warm up to this idea that evidence could at least bear on what the afterlife is like in a very broad way. I mean, I'm not, again, you're right, we're not making claims about rewards or punishments or anything like that, but I think we're both like, at least we're both on board with this idea that at least evidence can bear on at least some parts of what the afterlife is like.
Oh yeah, if you get the right kind of
Yeah.
evidence, you give us exactly what
Okay.
it's like. So I don't think it's impossible for evidence to indicate the heaven. That's definitely not something I would claim.
And we have some evidence because we have this, logicians and, theories that say there aren't contradictions. And so because we have that, we have evidence that the afterlife doesn't have contradictions.
Sure, I'm happy to grant that math and
Okay.
logic and I think therefore I am the cogito are all metaphysical facts. I can grant all of those.
In the afterlife too.
Yeah, everything. Metaphysics is
Okay.
everything.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so then I guess I mean, again, like I didn't come prepared to talk about this, and this is not something I'm an expert on. But if I was trying to get you, so I would say, look, we have some kinds of evidence about what the afterlife is like. Now let's go like read some books on heaven and hell and talk about different theories of it and kind of see, what's more likely and what's less likely, and maybe what certain religions teach. And like, I mean, I don't know, like take I don't want to like call it any certain religion, but you could I think come up with afterlives that sound really absurd and come up with other afterlives that sound less absurd. And then I would say like the less absurd ones have a higher probability than the more absurd ones. Like if the afterlife is like one flying pig and that's it. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you're just like I'm off board, I'm off the boat, I'm off the boat. But we could make up some pretty crazy afterlives. Like Alice in Wonderland. I mean, I don't know. Again, I didn't come prepared to talk about this, so this is completely off the cuff. But I'm wondering if, we start to put out these actual afterlives, if we could say, like, that seems like a more likely afterlife. Maybe one where we all just continue to live and it's like similar to Earth today, but just way better or something, like a version of the Earth, but like a blissful one. Versus, yeah, like some crazy thing like Alice in Wonderland. Like, I don't know, maybe you would say those are just equally probable, but I do wonder if we could kind of make progress that way. I don't know.
I'm not exactly sure. I don't think I would say one is more probable than the other, like an Alice in Wonderland afterlife as opposed to uh, just where we persist kind of an afterlife. I don't think I would say one is more likely than the other, except maybe in a like logical complexity kind of a way. The more features it has to it, maybe it'd be more
Mm-hmm.
less likely that way. But in
Yeah.
general, I would say that like a Alice in Wonderland afterlife would be exactly the same as a Harry Potter afterlife or a Christian afterlife. Just pick whichever book you want, and I'd say those are all essentially equal.
Yeah, I mean, there's also interesting questions about what even the Christian afterlife exactly is. I'm not an expert on it, I'm not a theologian, but there's versions of it that say God's basically going to restore the earth, but kind of take away the suffering and pain and bad parts of it. And then we're gonna like live on the earth maybe in a way that's not crazy different than we do now, but just there's not gonna be all the bad parts. I mean, I don't know, and I'm not trying to I'm not trying to turn this into an argument for Christianity or anything. I was just trying to get us to think about ways we might say one afterlife is maybe more probable or less probable than another.
Sure. And I'm
So,
always open to evidence. So if you have a way to
okay.
differentiate between a particular idea of heaven and its negation being imaginary, I'm happy to accept that too. Like I'm open to evidence. It's absolutely possible. I just don't know of any as far as I
Yeah.
can tell.
Okay, cool. No, I mean, I think like you're not as fully an afterlife skeptic as I initially thought, because you're willing to grant like the laws of logic hold, the laws of metaphysics hold, and maybe even that certain afterlives are more probable than others. Again, I did not come prepared with an argument for this, but I think we could potentially make progress. But I think that would probably require us again going and looking at some philosophy and theology and sort of seeing what they say, maybe looking at actual religions and comparing what claims they make about the afterlife to what other afterlives we could come up with. But I think this would be like a long project that I don't know if we could fully execute right here.
Yeah, we've been going for a little
Yeah.
over an hour, so that was essentially the scheduled time anyway. But it was so we
Okay.
should probably wrap up anyway. But yeah, it was great having you on. It was a really
Yeah.
fun conversation.
Yeah, this was super fun. You took this in a way I did not expect at all, which kind of made it fun, but also was like, oh, I don't know, but I enjoyed it. So yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And could you send me a link to your paper because I'll put that in the description for people to read if they want to.
I would love to do that. Yeah, for sure. And happy to, yeah, talk more if people have questions about the paper or anything like that. But yeah, thanks again. This
Yeah,
was great.
awesome. Good luck with your conversation with Cosmic Skeptic.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, that's Thursday, so we'll see.
Yep.
All
Well, yeah,
right.
again, it
Thanks,
was great
Tom.
talking with you. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, see ya.
Bye.